I'm Zachary Moses with HE Travel, and I'm here talking to Dr. Dave Vaughn. Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah. Actually honored to be the Executive Director of Mote's Tropical Research Lab in the Florida Keys. And that's a laboratory that works on coral reefs. But we are the field station that deals with coral reefs. And specifically, we've tailored reef restoration, which is a whole new term today. We started with getting one of every one of the species, sort of Noah's Ark of the corals, and bringing those corals into the laboratory to give them their own aquarium, safe and sound. So if, heaven forbid, they went extinct in the wild, we would have some living tissue, just like a zoo would have a couple of pandas and try to make sure the pandas did not go extinct.
When you're dealing with corals that way, like if you're dealing with trees, you get seeds and you can put them in a drawer. How do you store your Noah's Ark of coral?
Actually, it just looked like a large aquarium that you might find in a restaurant or somebody's home. And we would have PVC racks that we just sat them on like books. And with lights coming down, they had these shelves, so they each got enough light to be able to grow. But the biggest jump was when we learned that if you cut them into tiny, tiny pieces, something stimulates them to grow very, very fast. So this was a breakthrough that actually was caused by a breakage. And sometimes your biggest advancements are your biggest mistakes, and this was one of those times.
And how did you do that? What was the mistake you made?
Well, we decided about 11 years ago that we wanted to try to see if we could collect the naturally spawned eggs and sperm that were produced by corals once a year, at the chance that 1 in a million might make it and form a new offspring. It's actually a free-swimming larvae of a coral, swims around and finds a spot to settle down to. And what we discovered is that out of 1 million eggs, instead of 1 in a million making it every 100 years, our first try we got 10 or 11 to make it. And we were disappointed though, because after 1 full year they weren't any bigger than the size of a pencil eraser. It was so slow that this no longer was a viable opportunity for growing coral. So I took them off their elevated racks and put them on the base of the aquarium on the bottom, thinking that I would just give them some space but not the prime locations, and we would just see how they did. And what happened is we went to clean the corals from the aquarium and put them in another aquarium, and I went to reach for the one and it stuck, so I yanked it and didn't realize it had grown over the backside of the base it was on and attached itself to the coral base, bottom of the coral aquarium. And when I did, it broke off a piece about the size of my thumbnail, and it left behind 3 little coral polyps by themselves. And I thought, the parent coral with that big hole in it is going to be very stressed, and I'll better watch out for this in case it's not doing well. And the 3 little polyps left behind had no chance of survival, in my opinion. That's not what happened. What happened was, just a couple weeks later, I went and looked and picked up the coral that had the big hole in it, and it had already repealed and repaired itself, that same tissue, in 2 weeks, that it took it the size to grow in 2 years.
Wow.
And I literally went running back to the old aquarium to see those little polyps, and was surprised that they had grown to the size of a nickel or a dime. Went up to 10 or 15 polyps, and I cut them each into 1 more, and did the science experiment now of testing 1 small, we now call it microfragment, onto each their own base, and it grew up to the same size that it took 3 years, but it only took 3 months.
Do you experiment with getting like smaller and smaller, or is it just literally down to 1 polyp?
We're down to 1 polyp. We can, really my staff, we have 2 great scientists here, Chris and Joey, who do this on a daily basis, and they're very good at dissecting down all the way down to even 1 polyp.
Wow. What's the survival rate when you break the polyps down? Do you lose some of the polyps? in
No,
the
pretty good survival. They regularly get 90% survival or so, and they can fill a table full of 1,000 new corals in just one afternoon.
What would you say your biggest limitations are at this point?
Like most things, it's space, time, energy, money, and it took 6 years to produce 600 corals. We have over 16,000 corals that we fragmented. Probably another 6,000 that we now successfully raised from egg. So really the space and the money is the limit. So if we are able to gain more ground and buy more tanks and get some more assistant, there's no reason that we can't go from 20,000 corals to 200,000, and in 4 or 5 years be able to plant 1 million corals out there. That's not just a pie in the sky, it's a reality that could happen in just the next few years.
Coral restoration, obviously it's important. Why?
Oh, most people ask that question, but I think they down deep inside know most of those anyway. And first of all, if you've ever dove down in the Keys, it's why everybody comes here. It's a beautiful place to snorkel or scuba dive because the underwater reef is really the oasis of a forest underwater. So less than 1% is coral reefs, but that's where all the animals go to feed and breed and spend nursery time, is where 25 to 40% of our fisheries is located. If you had a giant desert and a little oasis with a spring, where would all the animals be? In the state of Florida, we have probably a $5 billion value of our coral reefs. Here in Monroe County, probably close to $1 billion economically. So economically, it's worth $1 billion. If you were a $1 billion company, you surely would put 1% of your value into keeping that business going. So if we had 1% of that $1 billion available for coral restoration, we could be taking some of these threatened species off the endangered species list.
So what are some of the consequences to us on land here in the Keys to losing the coral reefs beyond just the beauty and the underwater oasis?
Most of our houses are just, the land is just 2 feet above the water. And why is that? The Atlantic Ocean is right here. The Atlantic Ocean 2 days ago had 10 to 20 foot waves. What happened to those waves? Those waves came in, hit our living barrier reef 5 miles offshore, and came into shore here as a 2-inch ripple. If we hadn't had that living reef there, we would have yesterday had 20-foot waves over the top of all of the Florida Keys.
That's a big deal if you're going to own a home in the Keys, if you're going to live here at all.
If in the next 100 years we come up 1 more foot, don't we want our living reef to also grow up 1 more foot to equal the sea level rise? Well, that won't happen if we have a dead reef. Only a living reef will continue to grow up, hopefully equaling what the sea level rise could do.
As the reef grows, it's just the top that's alive.
That's right. It's if, like my hat, if this were a coral, the shape this, it would only be this top part like the fabric of the hat that is alive, but as it grows, it expands and gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and what's left behind is calcium carbonate rock. It's what 130,000 years ago, we're standing in the Florida Keys of what was our barrier reef.
When you're restoring the actual corals, how do you attach the corals?
We'll take a coral head, like a boulder, like a big rock, and we'll take the corals that were grown on our plugs, as we call them, and the plug has a little stem on it, just like it was on a small mushroom or similar to a golf tee. And we put a hole in the dead coral rock of a brain coral, and then we insert the living plugs onto that, so that just as if you were plugging a yard for a new lawn. you have choices. You could throw seed out there and hope it grows. You could sod the whole thing solid, or you could put little plugs in every foot and wait a year or two for it to grow. That's what we're doing. We're plugging little pieces of live coral so that in a year or two it will merge into one big coral lawn.
Dave, how many species of coral are you regrowing here in your facility?
We have 28 species, more or less, of hard corals in the Florida Keys. We have them all in here in captivity just to make sure we have a gene bank of living tissue. But there's the top 12 that is mostly found in the larger number. Just as if you were going through an oak and a maple and a pine forest, there's major species. We are mainly doing the brain coral, the boulder coral, the mountain coral, the star coral, but also the staghorn and elkhorn coral. We started, and most people start with coral restoration with the staghorn coral. And it's called staghorn because it really looks like a deer's antlers. And it is a fast-growing coral. We'd start with a piece about this big, something like the size of your small finger, and in 1 year it will produce 3 or 4 branches, and look the size and shape of your hand with 3 or 4 branches each 3 or 4 inches long. And most people have seen these reef-building corals just as looking like big rocks, some the size of a Volkswagen, and not realize that some of those corals are 100, 200, 300 or more years old. And they're very slow growing, which is why everybody else did not want to work with those corals. In fact, I sort of coined them the orphan corals.
Dave was telling me earlier that he is going to retire after he plants 1 million coral. And we should see, what are some ways that we could speed that along?
Give me one of those pills so I live for another 100 years. No, really, I'm 62 years old now, so I don't say that lightly that I want to plant 1 million corals before I retire. But like any business or like any operation, it takes some space, it takes some energy in the form of labor of people, and it takes a little bit of money support. Our first corals 10 years ago cost us close to $1,000 a coral because of only producing so few. Then just 5 years ago it was under $100 a coral, and now is well under $25 a coral, and I expect it to be $10 a coral, the cost. So for $10 million we can actually plant 1 million corals that funds and supports a $1 billion a year industry in the Florida Keys alone. When I grew up, I actually thought I wanted to be a park ranger because I learned that you could have a job protecting some of the above ground forests, or you could learn how to manage a forest. Now today, kids have the opportunity to be an underwater park ranger. We really need protected areas, we need managers, we need underwater ecologists, biologists, and we need coral restoration biologists to aquaculture corals and plant them out and monitor them. I think there's a wonderful career ahead for the kids of tomorrow.
Zachary Moses with HE Travel. I'm talking with Dave Vaughn of the Mote Marine Laboratory. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here.
All right.
So this new lab will be literally a center for coral reef research for restoration technologies, and we hope to host scientists from around the world.